This is ALHS 1011, and today we're going to be talking about the skeletal system. These are our learning objectives from the syllabus. Okay, I love the skeletal system. This is fun. There are 206 bones in the human body, and basically the functions are support. We would just be a blob of gel if we didn't have the skeletal system. Movement, they partner with the muscles. Protection, they protect, especially like our rib cage protects a lot of vital organs. The cranium protects our brain. Acid-base balance, we'll get to that, and electrolyte balance. And blood formation happens in the bone marrow. So this is some classifications. We have long bones, okay? And these are longer than they are wide, and they're found in our arms and our legs. Short bones found in our wrists and ankles, okay? Flat bones, these can be either flat or curved, but they're plate-like. And they would be in our skull, our ribs, our breastbone, our sternum. Okay. And then our regular shape bones. These look more like a jigsaw puzzle. They might be odd in shape, our hip bone, our vertebrae, really interesting shape. The sesamoid bones are small and round, and they're found near tendons. Okay, this is an important concept for you to understand. We have what we call the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So think appendages for appendicular. Appendicular are your arms, your legs, your hips, and your shoulders. They are 126 bones. Whereas the axial is really just there are 80 bones, and it's your cranium, your skull, your spinal column, your vertebrae, some parts of your middle ear, but really it's your trunk. However, don't get confused. The pelvis is not part of the axial skeleton. The pelvis is contained in the appendicular skeleton. Half of our total 206 bones are located in our hands and feet. Okay, so appendicular and axial. Okay. Axial, like I said, cranium, hyoid bone, okay, vertebra or spinal column, and ribs. Okay, it's not the pelvis. It's not the shoulder blades. It's kind of like our core, our trunk. Okay. The human skull, we'll start here, protects the hat and houses the brain. Okay. It has openings for our nose, our eyes, our ears, and it's on our mouth. It's a common, it's our passageway for our respiratory and digestive system. It has some fibrous connective tissue that allows some movement, some flexibility. Okay. Our cranial bones are named for the region of the brain, essentially. So the frontal lobe protects the frontal region of the brain. The parietal protects the sides and roof of the brain. Occipital bone protects the occipital region of the brain or the back. Your temporal bone protects the temporal region of the brain. Then you have the sphenoid, which is next is the red part here. It's a kind of around the eye orbits. The ethmoid includes the eye orbits and the nasal cavity. So it's a little more forward. Here's some pictures of some facial bones. So we have lacrimal near the eye ducts. The maxilla is the front part of your face, above your teeth. There's zygomatic bones, the mandible, is your jaw. Sinuses, which are cavities inside your skull, also kind of correspond to the region of the brain and the region of the bone that they're near. So our frontal sinus is over our frontal bone and a frontal region of the brain. The sphenoid is more onto the side. Ethmoid, nose and eyeball orbits. And the maxillary sinus is that front of the face again. So that kind of makes it a little helpful. After the cranium, we have the spinal cord or the vertebral column, and that protects the spinal cord, which is the superhighway for the nervous system. And there are 26 bones, and there are 5 regions to this vertebral column. The first 7 bones are the cervical bones, 1 through 7, and the atlas and the axis being the first 2. So C1 or cervical 1 and C2, which is cervical 2, is the axis. Okay. There are 12 thoracic, larger bones in the T section here of the vertebral column, 5 lumbar vertebrae, then the sacrum, and then the coccyx is the tailbone. Okay. There are 4 curves, so our vertebral column is not straight. There should be some natural cervical curvature in the C1 through C7. T1 and through T12 has a natural curvature, and then the lumbar spine should have some curvature. Okay, the curves are important, otherwise we would not have balance and for movement. And there are discs in between, intervertebral discs that are shock absorbers. So when we are in utero or shortly after, our spine looks much like a C. We don't have these distinct curvatures. And as development happens, we form these curvatures. Okay, these are some abnormalities in curvatures. So scoliosis happens when there's a lateral shift from where the spine should be. Kyphosis is there, also known as humpback, is there's a forward or anterior shift. And lordosis is a kind of an exaggerated lumbar or sway back curvature to the spine. Here's the vertebrae, okay? And remember, those are irregular bones. There's a body, there's a hole or vertebral foramen, and that's where the spinal cord goes. There are transverse, remember trans means across, transverse processes, spinal processes, okay? Here's the rib cage, the next part of the axial skeleton. So remember, the axial skeleton is the cranium, the vertebra, and the thoracic cavity, cage. And that protects the heart, the lungs, and great blood vessels. It's flexible. We have cartilage here that allows us movement when we breathe. We have the sternum, which is part of that. The sternum has the manubrium, body, and the xiphoid process, which can be broken off during CPR. So be careful there. And your hands for CPR would go on the body of the sternum. Okay. The manubrium, these are the parts I'm telling you that are important to know, is manubrium, the part of the sternum, the body, and then the xiphoid process. The ribs, okay, so just like the vertebrae, the ribs, there are different sections to the ribs. True ribs, pairs 1 through 7, are also called vertebrosternal because they attach to the sternum. Okay, if you remember, they attach to the vertebrae and they attach to the sternum. Okay, false ribs, what are called false ribs, are vertebrocostal. So costal vertebra, you see the root there, are pairs 8 through 10. Costal means ribs, but it connects to the cartilage and not directly to the sternum itself. Okay. And then floating ribs are 11 and 12, and they have no front or no anterior attachment. Hyoid bone. This is a U-shaped bone between the mandible or the jawbone and the larynx, which is the voice box. It doesn't attach or articulate to any other bones. Okay, so we've done the axial skeleton. Now let's move to the appendicular. So we have two girdles, we call them. One is a shoulder girdle or pectoral girdle, and the other is the pelvic girdle. And the pectoral consists of the clavicle, the collarbone, and the scapula or the shoulder bone. So that's the pectoral girdle. The pelvic girdle is the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis bones of the pelvis. Okay, so ilium is this top curved portion of the bone. Ischium is the part I sit like, it sounds like tush. You sit on your tush, ischium, and the pubis. Okay, and there you can see that a female pelvis is different from a male pelvis in that pubic angle. That pubic angle is wider in a female for childbirth. Okay, so appendicular, upper and lower extremities, and it's highlighted in this picture nicely. What's in white is the axial skeleton. What's in pink is the appendicular. So most of our movement happens here. Okay, we have humerus, large bone in the arm, long bone. We have a femur in the legs. Two smaller bones for the arm. The forearm is the radius and ulnar. And likewise in the lower extremity, the tibia and fibula. There are 5 single bones, metacarpals in the hands, metatarsals in the foot, and all the digits. So whether or not they be fingers or toes, the digits are called phalanges. Okay, here's another good photo, really reiterating that pectoral girdle, which is the scapula and the clavicle. Okay, it's upper. And you can see here you have humerus, ulna, radius. You know radius is the radius because it's closest to the thumb, and the radial pulse is closest to the thumb. Okay, you've got carpals, wrist bones, metacarpals, hand bones, and then fingers or phalanges. So here we go. Humerus, radius, okay. Ulna is the smaller one. And the elbow is a joint. Okay. You got your carpals of the wrist, metacarpals of the hand, the palm of the hand, and then your fingers are the phalanges. Now the pelvic girdle. You've got coxal bones that form so they're kind of rigid. They form the sacrum and the coccyx. Okay, in the back, the sacrum is the larger bone, and the coccyx is a little tailbone. The ilium is the top curvature part. Ischium is where you sit. Okay, and pubis is in the center. Okay, and that pubic angle would determine whether a skeleton is a female or a male. Okay, you can see here the female is larger and curved. The pelvic arch on the male is smaller. So very distinct, wider, shallower for the female to allow a head to pass through, and definitely more rounded opening. The lower leg, we kind of mentioned, the femur is the thigh bone, longest, strongest bone in the body. Then you have the patella, which is the kneecap, and that's a sesamoid bone. Okay. It's kind of in the tendon, okay? The tibia is the shin bone, tib, shin. I don't know how you can pair that, but tibia is the shin bone, the larger one, and fibula, eula maybe sounds smaller, is the slender side bone. Okay. Then you have the tarsals, 7 tarsals in the ankle. Metatarsals are the foot bones. And then phalanges are the toes. The calcaneus is the heel bone. So calcaneus is the heel bone. Okay, so what are bones? We talked about the skeleton. So what are bones? Because they mostly make up the skeleton. A lot of it is non-living calcium and phosphorus, and it's constantly building and repairing itself. It's in a constant state of regeneration. So a little histology. Histology, study of the tissues, remember. Bones are connective tissue. Okay, they are organic. There are bone cells, and they are osteoid, which are non-mineral bone, which it has the collagen and the proteins in it. And then there are inorganic cells in it. Okay, cartilage is also connective tissue. So you have bone as connective tissue and cartilage as connective tissue. Okay, so I like this slide because it talks about the different bone cells. So genic, like Genesis in the Bible, is the formation. That means formation or beginning. Osteo meaning bone. So osteogenic means it's forming bone. Okay? It's developing, it's forming bone. So an osteogenic cell, let me move, I don't know if you can see these. Move this over here. So an osteogenic cell is also called an osteoprogenitor. That's the same thing. And an osteocyte just means bone cell. So an osteogenic cell becomes an osteocyte or cell, okay? And there are 2 types. We have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And if you remember B in the blasts, build, those build up new tissue, okay? Osteoclasts break down or consume. So clasts consume, blasts build. And those are the 2 types of osteocytes. Ooh, I think I skipped. Osteocytes are mature. That's what happens after osteogenesis. They're mature. They were originally osteoblasts. They surround themselves, they form. So an osteocyte is going to form the bone matrix. An osteoclast is going to reabsorb some bone or break it down. Okay, so osteoblasts arise from the osteogenic cells or osteoprogenitor cells. And again, it secretes calcium like a matrix, like a web. It makes minerals and it's building up the bone. So you can see here, osteoblasts building up the bone. In the second picture, you're going to see osteoclasts breaking down the bone. Okay, so osteoclasts, remember, they consume. They may have originated from monocytes, which is a type of white blood cell. But what they're doing is they're tearing down bone material and they're moving calcium and phosphate in the blood. So your osteoblasts are building, your osteoclasts are breaking down. So it's a constant building and consuming in this regeneration process. So bone tissue, remember cells organized together for a common function or a tissue. Bones, the bone tissue itself is several different components. Compact bone is what we think of when we think of bone, is dense, hard, tightly packed. It's found in the shafts of our long bones and the outer layer of all bones. And they have these Haversian systems, which are osteons. okay? And mature, they contain the mature osteocytes. So it's kind of this circular. So if you took a look at this long bone here, that's made up of a lot of these Haversian canals that are circular, round, concentric circles around a core. And there's a Haversian canal in the center, and it contains blood vessels. Then there's spongy bone or cancellulous bone. And there's a lot of words here. Trabeculi. Trabeculi are the cancellous bones are, so you have compact bone on the outside of this flat bone, and in between you have some spongy bone or the cancellous bone. And that cancellous bone is spongy, kind of looks like a sponge, and it's got openings, it's got holes, it's got almost like pores, it's got space between them. And those irregular holes between the trabeculi in that creates a space where bone marrow is, red bone marrow is. And our red bone marrow is produces red blood cells. And most of this is done in flat bones. Okay, so flat bones, most of this is done in flat bones. Here's a nice picture of the osteons, and they run parallel. Okay, they've got blood flow. You can see the blood flow. You can see the Haversian canals where the blood vessels are. Okay, you can see each one of these concentric circles are a Haversian system. Okay. And so they're passageways that are connecting them to ensure nutrients and oxygen get to the bone cells or the osteocytes. We mentioned cartilage being a special form of dense connective tissue. It's pretty strong. It can handle a lot of flexion, tension, pressure, has no nerve or blood vessels. So if you cut it, it's not going to bleed. Now, if you cut your ear cartilage, that's going to bleed because there's skin there, but the cartilage itself, no. Permanent cartilage we have on our ears and our nose, and articulate cartilage. So what articulation means a joint. So it's a cushion between the bones. So cartilage between bones, we call that articulate cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, I think we talked about this in the tissue chapter, is very abundant, it's very flexible, resilient, elastic being a little more stretchy. Fibrocartilage is thick, tensile, it's strong, it's a shock absorber. Okay, so as you can see in this picture here, we've got cartilage in our ear, that's a permanent cartilage in our nose, some articulate cartilages in our joints, in our intervertebral discs. The pubis symphysis has cartilage, okay, and also our joints down here. So hyaline cartilage found in our nose, some in our costal cartilage, articular, and it covers the ends of long bones. Okay, our elastic is found in the ears. Okay, so hyaline cartilage covers the end of long bones, whereas elastic is in the ears. Fibrocartilage is the ones between the intervertebral discs, the meniscus of the knee, and the pubis symphysis. So it's more dense, it's more thick, it's less flexible. Okay, looking at bone anatomy, and we'll look at a long bone for an example. The epiphysis, okay, are the ends. The two ends are called epiphysis. Okay, the diaphysis is the long part of the bone, the region between the two epiphyses. Inside of the diaphysis, we have a medullary cavity, and it's hollow. and it stores yellow marrow. Wait a minute. That's reminding me of something. Red marrow. Red marrow, going back a few, right here. Red bone marrow was found in flat bones, producing red blood cells. Okay. Now we have yellow marrow, which has high fat content. It can convert to red marrow, which makes red blood cells in a pinch, in an emergency. So this is the backup plan. So yellow bone marrow or yellow marrow in our long bones is more fatty, but in a pinch, if necessary, it can convert to red bone marrow, creating red blood cells if necessary. Okay. Okay, the layers of the bone. So peri means around, okay, periosteum is the outermost layer. Okay? It's tough, it's fibrous, it covers the bone. And it contains the blood, lymph, and nerves. It acts as an anchor point for ligaments and tendons. And we'll get to this in a second, but ligaments connect bone to bone. Tendons connect bone to muscle. Endo, meaning inside, is the inside of membrane, and that lines the medullary cavity, where the yellow marrow is contained. So inside that diaphysis, that long part of the bone, yellow marrow is, and the endosteum is kind of the membrane around that. The peri around the whole thing is the tough layer around the whole bone. Okay, so I mentioned that articulations just means joints, and these are necessary for movement. Joints or articulations are a place where two or more bones join together. Some of them are immobile, like in our skull. Some of them can move a little bit, like the pubic symphysis in our pelvis, to allow a head to pass through. And some of them move freely, like our elbow. Okay, the knee joint. The knee joint has a lot of fibrocartilage called the menisci, which acts as shock absorbers, thank goodness, right? It's a fairly unstable joint. You can hurt your knee fairly easily. And it is held together, the knee joint, by 5 ligaments. And remember, ligaments connect bone to bone. Okay. You've got your fibrous joints, which are relatively, hopefully, immovable, okay, at the sutures in your skull. So where the bones come together, you've got a little bit of fibrocartilage, okay? Cartilaginous joints, there you go, say that 5 times quick, are held together. So it's a joint that's held together by cartilage, and it's either immobile or mobile. And an example of that is that pubic symphysis that moves a little bit, sometimes with a female, and the joints between ribs and sternums when we breathe. So it does allow for some movement. The synovial joint, now we mentioned this when we talked about membranes, is a shock absorber. It prevents grinding, okay? There's a bursa, which is a fluid-filled sac around the knee. Bursa is contained here, and it secretes a lubricant, and that lubricant is synovial fluid. And if you remember, this synovial membrane contains synovial fluid, so our bursa is secreting that. We also talk about articulations or joints by structure. So synovial joints obviously have a synovial membrane. We talk about their function too. So gliding joints would be like our wrists that have lateral movements. The saddle joint The only saddle joint in the body, I believe, is the thumb joint, the first metacarpal. The ball and socket describes how it moves, right? It can move in rotation, like a ball and socket. And you can see these little pictures here are helpful. Hinge joints would be like your elbow or your knee. It moves like a hinge. Pivot joints, elbow would be a pivot. It can internally rotate and externally rotate. And ellipsoidal is like your wrist. So we'll go into those in depth, the motions. So we have flat, slightly curved, short bones, plate-like bones in your wrists and ankles. And those slide back and forth, gliding as if you're waving. Your hinge joint, just like it sounds, is knees and elbows. And that is your, one bone is cylindrical, the other bone is kind of like the trough, and it opens and closes like a hinge. Your saddle joint, one, and you can see this depiction here in the picture, one is like this, a saddle fitting into like a horse's back, and that's found at the base of the thumb, and it rocks side to side, up and down, side to side. Ellipsoidal or condyloid joints are oval. They have a depression. You can see this kind of metal recreation, and it has like a curved area, almost like it fits perfectly, okay? And these are the knuckles of the fingers. Pivot joints move like a turnstile, so they can rotate. They have a circular portion where the bone and a ring portion. And it's found in the neck and the forearm, so it rotates. Our ball and socket joints, just like what it sounds like, you have a spherical articulation, and then the kind of scooped out part of the bone, and that would be your hips and shoulders. It allows for rotation, all types of movement, so rotation. Okay, movement classifications. So abduct and adduct, this is going to sound terrible, but the way I remember this is if you abduct a person, let's just say a person, you're taking them away. So abduct means to move away from the midline. Adduct with the 2 Ds is toward a person. Flexion and extension. Let me see if I have exactly, no. Flexion, extension. Flexion is decreasing the angle of a joint. Extension is increasing. Eversion is turning outward. Inversion is turning inward. The neck can retract, bring back, and protract, bring forward. Down at the bottom, supinate. It's almost like you're holding a cup of soup in your hand, supinate. Pronate means belly down. Remember that from the first chapter. So hand down. Flexion and extension of the neck. To flex the neck, you're bringing it forward down towards your chin to your chest. Extension, lifting it up, and hyperextending is bringing it all the way back. And you can see that with the arm, increasing, decreasing the joint. Rotation, the neck rotates. Circumduction is moving rotation in a circle. And then dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. To dorsiflex, dorsal means back. It's bringing your toes up towards your back. Plantar flexion, plantar, if you remember from the regions, is the sole of the foot. And that's bringing that down. Okay, here's a little video on joint movement.
Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're going to take a look at the different movements that joints can perform. We're going to go through movements like this, for example, like this, and like this. What are these movements called? Let's take a look. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension. Lateral flexion. Lateral flexion. Circumduction. Circumduction. Abduction. Adduction. 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 Rotation. Rotation. Lateral rotation. Medial rotation. Lateral rotation. Medial rotation. Lateral rotation. Medial rotation. Lateral rotation. Medial rotation. Supinated, pronated. Supinated, pronated. Supinated, pronated. Elevation, depression. Elevation, depression. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. Inversion, eversion. Inversion, eversion.
Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Okay, so the surface structure of our bones is not smooth. There are little projections on it, little ridges, little grooves, depressions that make way for nerves and blood vessels, and also serve as a attachment point for muscles, ligaments, and tendons. Sometimes these projecting surfaces and depressions can form our joints or our articulation points. Okay, I mentioned this before, ligaments versus tendons. So both allow movement, but ligaments are connecting bone to bone, as in with this foot example here, this leg. And then in the elbow example, a tendon to muscle or the bursa, okay, muscle to bone, okay. So intramembranous ossification, that happens when bone develops between two sheets in utero, okay? An example of this is the skull. So there's two sheets and cells from connective tissue turn into osteoblasts, building that matrix, that skull, and eventually become osteocytes. Okay, so it creates compact bone over, it's the form of producing or making the compact bone over spongy bone. So here's kind of how the skull forms. Okay, there's a fontanelle, or what lay folk would call the soft spot on a baby's head, and the bones form in these directions. Okay, play this video.
The development of the skeleton's flat bones begins as certain mesenchymal cells at specific points within embryonic fibrous connective tissue develop into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts cluster together, secrete bone matrix, and develop into osteocytes that deposit calcium and other mineral salts that harden the forming bone matrix. The bony regions spread out into thin columns called trabeculae and form spongy bone tissue. A fibrous covering called the periosteum forms on the surface of the bone, and a layer of compact bone tissue replaces the upper layers of spongy bone. This process in which flat bones develop from connective tissue is called intramembranous ossification.
Okay, so I liked that one. This is showing endochondrial ossification, which is how the majority of our other bones grow.
Endochondral ossification is a step-by-step process in which a hyaline cartilage model of a bone is turned into osseous tissue. We start with a fetal tissue called mesenchyme, which develops into hyaline cartilage in the location of a future bone. The perichondrium of the cartilage eventually begins producing osteoblasts, which are bone-producing cells. These osteoblasts secrete bone matrix around the middle of the cartilage model, forming a bony collar that will become the diaphysis. Meanwhile, the chondrocytes, or cartilage cells, in the middle of the model begin to enlarge. This forms what's called the primary ossification center. The chondrocytes get so large that they form a cavity in the middle of the model. Blood vessels penetrate the area and bring stem cells into the cavity. The cavity then spreads throughout the model and becomes the primary marrow cavity of the future diaphysis. The stem cells give rise to osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts line the cavity and begin to calcify cartilage, forming a temporary network of trabeculae. As the bony collar expands throughout the diaphysis, osteoclasts break this calcified tissue down, hollowing out the marrow cavity. Soon after this process begins, secondary ossification centers begin to form at the ends of the model in the same way the primary center formed. Each end will become an epiphysis, filled with spongy bone. The epiphyses have their own blood supply and maintain a cartilage ring around themselves, the cap of which becomes the articular cartilage of a joint. The cartilage separating the epiphysis from the diaphysis is the epiphyseal growth plate that allows these bones to grow in length until early adulthood.
Okay, so I thought that was helpful, kind of putting it all together, showing you how things grow. So basically we're starting with compact bone, we're starting with that developing periosteum, which is that outer, and then you have the primary ossification center, which is in the center, which eventually becomes the medullary cavity, which holds the yellow bone marrow. And then you form, and that's in the diaphysis, then you form the epiphysis, the two ends, which become also ossification centers for growth. And you might have growth plates there. And eventually that spongy bone becomes compact bone. And this becomes the mature bone right here. Okay, so bones grow long and bones grow wide. Essentially, that's the take-home message here too. Okay. Osteoprogenitor cells, non-specific, we said that before, and they're found in the periosteum, the endosteum, and in the central canals. Okay, so osteoclasts break down, osteoblasts build. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay, and you may have growth plates. When we say, their growth plates are closed or they still have growth plates, that's that band of cartilage, the growth plate between the primary and secondary ossification centers. Some nutritional requirements for bone development. We need vitamin D for calcium absorption, and that vitamin D is called calcitriol in the active form, and that needs to be in that form to be absorbed in the small intestines. Okay. There is some feedback, biofeedback with calcium levels in the blood. I'm not going to get into this too much, but just know that if calcium levels, there is homeostasis happening here to control calcium levels too high in the blood, calcium levels too low. And a lot of that is regulated from the parathyroid. And the parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone, which helps us, if the calcium levels in the blood are too low, they'll help us raise blood calcium levels. Okay. Here's a little quick video about that.
Welcome. This video is going to cover calcium homeostasis. So calcium levels in the body, especially in the blood and in the extracellular spaces around our cells, is critically important. So it needs to be maintained for our body to function. Somewhere between 8 and 10 milligrams per deciliter is considered normal blood calcium. So if the calcium levels in your blood ever drop to a critically low level, the body's going to need to respond. Now, you might think of calcium as needed for your bones, but actually calcium is critically important for function of the brain and the heart. Little cardiac myocytes and neurons need calcium in order to have action potentials, to contract, and in order to release neurotransmitter. Even your skeletal myocytes and your muscles need calcium in order to function. So whenever calcium gets too low, how does the body regulate it and increase it back towards normal? It's actually the cells of the parathyroid glands located in the neck that are responsible for calcium regulation. They're actually found embedded in 4 little clumps on the thyroid gland. And these parathyroid gland cells have a special little calcium sensitive receptor which can sense the levels of calcium in the extracellular fluid. As blood calcium levels get low, these cells release more PTH through exocytosis. The parathyroid hormone then travels throughout the body, targeting various tissues. One of the primary targets of PTH will be the bones. So the little cells in bone are either building bone or chewing up the bone. You might remember osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Osteoblasts will build bone and osteoclasts chew up the bone. In the case of PTH signaling, the osteoblasts will become less active. The osteoclasts will become more active. This will release stored up calcium from the bone into the bloodstream, which will help increase blood calcium. Again, PTH changes the activity of these bone chewing and bone building cells so that more calcium is released from the bone matrix into the bloodstream, helping raise blood calcium levels. Another important target of PTH will be the kidneys. The kidneys are responsible for filtering things in blood, and then it can remove those from the body in urine. So since calcium's in your blood and calcium's very small, it easily filters into the kidneys. The kidney cells then must reabsorb the calcium and keep the calcium in the body. PTH is critically important to tell those cells to keep the calcium that is filtered. So as PTH levels go up, the little kidney cells know to keep more calcium, in essence reabsorbing it, adding it back to the bloodstream, and helping raise and keep our blood calcium levels high enough. So whenever PTH levels are high, the kidneys are reabsorbing more calcium, and less calcium ever makes it into the urine, and so the urine would have low calcium levels. Another important target for PTH is going to be the intestines. Since we get a little bit of calcium usually.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there because this video is more in depth than I kind of want to for this class. So, I mean, you're welcome to watch the whole video, but I just want you to have a general sense of calcium homeostasis. Okay. So again, the parathyroid gland, it does, this is the endocrine response to low calcium. It secretes parathyroid hormone, which it causes an increase in blood calcium basically in the blood. It stimulates osteoclasts to break down some bone to raise blood calcium levels. Okay. So, and this is another general, very general view of that homeostasis comes into play when we're talking about calcium levels in the blood, whether it rises or it decreases. Our body is constantly having homeostasis control it to the set point it needs to be at. Okay. So that is enough for that. I do want to emphasize that there is a list of bones to know. You do need to memorize some bones. So you'll find that in Blackboard. I went over a lot of the major bones today in this video, but I want you to really hone in and focus on the bones to know. Memorizing that and being able to label that from a diagram is very important for the test. And that's it. Thank you.